Linux Luddites, episode 63, for the 22nd of November, 2015. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Paddy.
And I'm Jesse. And this week we have an off the beaten path, which I feel may be so far from the main track that Paddy will be the only one speaking. We have your feedback, of course. And to round things off, we look at a distribution which is very alpha, is causing a few ripples amongst other people, and has a very odd way of selecting what software to look at. But before we get into all that, I just wanted to talk to you two guys about a discussion I was having at the pub the other day. And I was trying to explain to someone our show and the sort of ethos behind it and our sort of tagline and things like this. And in discussing it and partly discussing with her and going backwards and forwards, we sort of came to this conclusion that whether or not change is a sort of natural resistance because people resist it, or whether it's just the fact that something is new, but actually better, and once you get used to it, it's okay. So the conclusion came that if you use something for a while and then go back to what you were using, if that thing you go back to, you suddenly realise is not as good as what you were using, you clearly realise that that change has been progressive and has improved. But if you go back and you think, actually, I prefer what I was on before, but you have to use the new thing for long enough that you overcome your natural resistance to things that are new. So what do you think about that?
Well, a prime example that popped into my head as you were saying that was searchable menus, and specifically the whisker menu in XFCE.
Exactly the one that I thought of as well.
Okay, good. Because I tried out a lot of distros, and when I was messing around with my projector, I ended up settling on Cinnamon, and I started to really like the searchable menu. And then I went back to my Ubuntu installations and I didn't like the old menu anymore. And I thought that I liked hierarchical menus, but now I use the whisker menu everywhere. So what does that tell you? That means that exactly what you're saying, it must be progress, at least for me, and some change is progress.
No, what it tells me is you're wrong.
Maybe you just haven't used a different type of menu for long enough, Paddy.
No, I don't wish to be honest, because I have tried these things and they just upset me.
Have you ever lived with a searchable menu?
How long would you say living for?
I don't know, a couple of weeks?
No, good God, no.
Well, I think you might be missing out, you know. I mean, I know, Jesse, you weren't trying to be this specific about it. You're trying to raise a broader point. But I think you're right. You do need to try out new stuff. I mean, you've been living with Unity for, well, over a year now, haven't you?
Oh my word, has it been that long? Yeah, I think it has. I just keep on, we're discussing this before the show, I just keep on thinking there's things I need to back up and my, configuration files and things like this and photos and whatnot, and I just never quite get around to it, and I don't want to do it just before we do a podcast, so obviously I leave it, and yeah, maybe a year has indeed crept on.
But what have you got on your laptop?
Oh, that's got Mint Cinnamon.
And so you kind of switch backwards and forwards on that, and I mean, how do you feel switching?
Well, I think the majority of what I do with my main PC is this show. So, I mean, I have a list of maybe a dozen icons down the left on Unity, and they're the dozen things that I use. Whereas on my laptop, I use more things than that. I use more different bits of software. It's a faster processor, so I do all my photo editing on there, and it's more of a play thing, so I have a lot more. So I prefer having a searchable menu. And I know there's a searchable menu in Unity, obviously, but like I say, I only need these half dozen or so main things like Skype and Audacity for doing this show. And other than that, I don't really use Unity. I just go to those shortcuts and off we go.
Well, I wasn't trying to get at the searchable menu thing. I was just saying switching back and forward from one new way of doing everything and the old way of doing things with Cinnamon.
Oh, I see what you mean. But then I suppose I switched from an Android phone to Cinnamon, and that switch is also quite big. You just get you quickly fall back into place, don't you? I'm sure if you drove two cars and they had their various nuances, you'd inevitably switch without really thinking about it. And that's I think, what we all do, isn't it?
I suppose. So essentially what you're saying is that Unity is really great. And what I'm saying to you is you're fired.
I think the problem is I've made a rod for our own back because, as you were saying, a couple of weeks might be how long you need to sort of get involved with something to see whether or not you're used to that paradigm, overcome the sort of initial barrier to entry, and then step back to what it was you're using before. But we can't be in a position to use every single distribution for a month. We can't use every single bit of software that we're going to change to for a month. So I think we might have just undone some of our show content.
Yeah, I realise we're rat-holing this a bit and we do need to get on with this show, but it's interesting nonetheless, because I can remember I saw a post by Bruce Byfield on Datamation recently, and he was suggesting that from a menu point of view, that's historical and people shouldn't be worrying about menus anymore, and they should be going to activity-based desktops. And he's obviously a KDE user and thinks activities are the bee's knees. But he specifically calls out in that piece the fact that people have so many applications installed, it's just impractical to access them via a traditional hierarchical menu. And I'm afraid I simply don't agree with him.
I think it's just quicker. And maybe it's just because I don't learn where things are, because I never have to do that learning process in the first time with a searchable menu. And I know what you're saying. We are sort of going round and round with one particular topic, but it is a clear difference between those distributions which have searchable and those which don't. And I just think pressing one button and starting typing, and there it is for me quicker and easier. It's the same with LastPass, for example. I just click on LastPass on my browser, start typing the website that I want to go to, and it's there. So I don't have to go through my various subsections and divisions and things.
You know, I think that only works in the sort of environments you're talking about because you've got this sort of semantic search, haven't you, where it's not just the application name that's being looked up. I mean, that was something else that Bruce picked up on, was the fact that a lot of open source applications have got the most preposterous of names that bear no relationship whatsoever to what the task is that they're trying to achieve. So people would never guess just by doing a sort of straight name search.
Yeah, spot on. I mean, some of the music applications, and we'll come back to this when we look at this distribution, but one of those is called Lollipop. And what does that have to do with music at all? And they all come up with weird names and things. So I guess I look up gedit on Unity, and it's called text editor. And obviously it's the wrong way around. You should be typing text editor. But it, like you say, it knows sort of the second and third levels of what it does. So it makes it a lot more easy. But if you have to know every name, I'd probably be scratching my head for things that I use very commonly, because you just know that's the text editor. Why would I learn some weird, almost unpronounceable name for it, whatever it might be? But I know that you are probably groaning at the fact we've nattered on for quite so long. So let's give you a chance to shine. Let's have a look at the off the beaten path.
Well, I think Jesse was perhaps a little harsh when he suggested this is a really off the beaten path thing, but listen on and we'll find out. As regular listeners will know, we host our website and serve all the show audio files and also run a mail server on a DigitalOcean droplet. And I've been meaning to upgrade it for some time now and finally got around to doing so a couple of weeks back. And hopefully nobody noticed any interruption in service. Anyhow, one of the reasons we plug DigitalOcean, and you can help support the show by using our affiliate link at linuxluddites.com/DigitalOcean, is that this sort of thing can be done really easily using their service. I mean, for a straight CPU, disk space or bandwidth upgrade, it's normally just a few clicks in the control panel to snapshot your system, briefly take your virtual machine offline, resize the droplet and restore the disk snapshot. Thing is, when I originally set up our box, I decided to use 32-bit version of Debian as the base OS. But I now wanted to move over to 64-bit Ubuntu because of the more predictable long-term support available. And that meant I was back to building up a server from scratch. And at the risk of sounding like an ad for DigitalOcean, they do make this a reasonably painless process by having whole environments available out of the box. So I actually started by spinning up a droplet with a lamp stack pre-installed as my base. And then I dug out my notes to see how I last set up Exim and Courier, what additional security hardening I'd previously used, and so on. Now, we've probably all been there. I mean, when you're faced with doing something very rarely, you either need very decent notes to follow or tools that help you along with the process. And it was thinking about tools that reminded me that we really ought to cover MyCLI on the show.
So this is something that you've come across in your own time for something else, not specifically dug out to do a task for our upgrade?
Yeah, this is something I came across a few months back and thought was interesting, but never actually had any course use myself. And I must admit I didn't in this case, but I still think it's worth telling other people about, because if you only occasionally need to manage a SQL database, it can be really easy to forget things like table and column names, never mind the actual syntax of SQL itself. And in the case of MySQL, that often means that people just whack up an instance of things like phpMyAdmin and use the web interface for their database admin. But phpMyAdmin doesn't exactly have the most enviable track record from a security point of view, and I really would never recommend anyone use it. And I guess other options that might make life easier tend to be quite bloated, and at least in the case of Oracle's MySQL Workbench, for instance, are famously crashy. And all of that means that I suspect many of you out there probably fire up the command line MySQL client and just struggle through.
Well, I know I do. When I had to set up the Pi podcast, I had to remember how I'd done the JRS one, and I just basically have to Google everything. And how many times do I do it where I don't do the semicolon? And I'm wondering, why hasn't it worked? Oh, right, yeah, I didn't end it with a semicolon. So I think that this is basically aimed at me.
Yeah, it could well be. I mean, if this sounds familiar to anybody else out there, then you may well be interested in a project called MyCLI. And MyCLI is an alternative terminal client for MySQL, and it offers a lot of the functionality that's missing out of the box. It's written in Python and released under the 3-clause BSD license. And if you're one of those who tend to look down their nose at MySQL and MariaDB, it's worth noting that the author has also coded an enhanced client for PostgreSQL.
So that's one of the additional features. What are the main features that MyCLI has?
Well, I guess the main one for most folks would be the fact it supports auto-completion with pop-up prompts. And that works not just for SQL statements, but also on table and column names. Anyone who's looked at SQL in the past will know that the language itself doesn't make this a particularly straightforward thing to do because of the order of the clauses in your statements. For instance, a typical statement might be selecting from several columns of a specific table, but autocomplete wouldn't be able to prompt the relevant column names until it knew which table you're referring to. But MyCLI does take a stab at this by offering up all column names, or you can just leave a gap in your statement until after you enter the table name and then just back cursor and it'll actually populate it with the correct data.
Now, I was wondering how that could possibly work. And then I have clicked the link that you put in the notes and looked at this animated GIF, and it's amazing. That it just looks incredibly useful, this auto-completion. You get kind of a drop-down list, and you can just select any of those from the list, or the closer you get to what you want, the fewer options there are on that list. And this just looks amazing to me. It looks like it's going to stop me having to actually learn how to deal with databases.
I think you probably still need to have a little bit of an idea of what you're doing. But, I mean, it does have some other nice features like syntax highlighting and configurable key bindings. And it also provides history and search functionality. And going back to something you said earlier, Joe, you can actually turn off semicolon as a requirement to end your statement. So you can have multiple line ones requiring a semicolon if you like, but out of the box, it doesn't actually require a semicolon at the end of the line. So it just struck me that if you're only an occasional user of the MySQL command line interface, then MyCLI could well make your life a fair bit easier. And as Joe mentioned, there's quite a nice little animated GIF on their website, which I'll stick a link to in the show notes, so you can see it in action before you take the plunge.
I mean, I'd kind of jokingly said that it means I don't have to learn it. But I mean, do you think that this could help someone like me actually learn and progress and know what they're doing?
That's a tricky one. I'm always nervous of tools that try and do that as opposed to helping someone who knows what they're doing. I mean, it can be really dangerous if you don't know what you're doing just to accept prompts. I mean, the point of this is that if you can't remember the exact syntax, it will prompt the syntax for you, which is a good thing and is potentially why it's useful to people out there. Or you can't remember what the column names are in your tables, but you know it's the WordPress table or something, then that's really helpful to know without having to go and look up all the syntax on Google to find out how you list your table columns, etc. I'm not really sure about actually learning SQL out of the box now.
Well, I don't mean learning from scratch, but if you've got something of an understanding, could it help kind of progress that and increase your knowledge? Or do you think that it's more for people, as you've said, who have that knowledge in the first place, but kind of don't do it often enough to remember it all. I mean, it's like that classic XKCD comic about the exact flags for untarring something, and even with a gun to your head, you probably wouldn't be able to remember.
Yeah, I think more the latter, to be honest. But that could just be my caution.
And has this been produced by someone just out of their love of MySQL and command line, or is this from a sort of a big software company or something?
Well, that was the other reason I wanted to bring it up, though, as a project, and how it came to be written is quite interesting. I mean, the development of MyCLI was funded via a Kickstarter campaign, and I think that seems to be quite a rare thing still for software. And after launching his campaign in April, the author raised just over $4,800 from 161 backers within the first month, and version 1 of MyCLI was released at the end of July. Now, the author's already produced a similar tool for PostgreSQL, as I mentioned earlier, so had a proven track record that he could deliver useful software in this problem space, which I'm sure helped contribute to the success of this crowdfunding campaign, as did the lack of an existing simple but functional tool, as I discussed earlier. So I was curious, really, what do you two guys think about crowdfunding for software projects? I mean, are the two factors I've mentioned, that it's a proven developer and it's a clearly defined problem space, all that's needed to make crowdfunding a viable way forward for other sort of projects?
I think the only other examples of software projects I can think of that have successfully crowdfunded are video editors. And I know that we mock them on this show because there are 1,000 of them, but I kind of hope that if someone is able to point at what they're trying to do and what their goal is going to be in the future, and people back it, and therefore it gets the right funding and they can move to that goal. My hope there in this specific case of video editors is that, dare I say it, others die off and one becomes the best. But that's a very different market, because that is one in which there are many and people are trying to differentiate themselves between the various other projects, competitors, whatever you want to call them. But like you say, this is basically a void, an empty space. The problem you have with this one, and I was surprised when you said it was a Kickstarter and got funded, was that it's a bit too, it's niche. And how do you get that how do you get the voice out there? How do you get the publicity to say, this is what I'm doing? Why don't all you people who require this very niche thing come and back me? It's not going to be, shown on like Reddit and The Verge and things like this. So I think he's got a real problem with getting it out there, getting the word out there. But for this actual piece of software, he clearly couldn't have done it without Kickstarter. So I'm glad he has. I just think it's unusual and don't think it is a good way of doing it.
Yeah, but don't you think that even for all these niche areas, there are little groups of people who communicate in certain places? I mean, on a particular subreddit, or we're talking about DBAs here. I mean, DBAs have their own magazines, and there are particular websites that DBAs visit. And as I mentioned, he only got just over 160 backers, but that was sufficient to actually fund writing this. So if all you're looking at is getting a couple hundred folks to pony up some cash, and you can sort of get $5,000 in, and that's sufficient to write a little software project, that seems perfectly reasonable.
It seems like a reasonable idea, but I think that you've got the perpetual problem of funding free software, and that is that people don't really want to pay for it generally. I mean, I suppose you can look at the humble bundles. I mean, I know that's generally not open source free software, but it's at least software for Linux, and people are willing to pay for it. But if you look at a hardware Kickstarter like the Pebble watch, when you can actually get something tangible in your hands, people seem to be more willing to contribute to that. Whereas even if that software that they're going to get from it is really, really useful and going to solve another problem, it's almost too abstract. It's not a physical thing in your hand that you can play with. And I think that is going to be a problem. And that's why I was fairly surprised to hear that this was a successful Kickstarter.
Yeah, I guess to answer Paddy's point, as long as he has a group or a known outlet that you can get to these developers or the people who want to use that particular bit of software, there's a mailing list or a website or something, brilliant, get the word out there. But if you don't know that and you're trying to fill another niche void, I think it'd be really difficult for people just browsing Kickstarter to decide to do it. And I suppose your point, Joe, is that the same thing could be said for art, whether it be physical art or music or things like this. People don't feel they should pay for it now because it's just music. I can get it on YouTube or online or what have you. I can stream it. But for that person to have originally made that in the first place, they need a they need a kickstart. They need to get the funding up front, don't they? Normally.
Well, Jesse said this was really obscure and that we wouldn't have any interest in it. But it turns out that I actually do have an interest in it and will almost definitely be checking this out because, as I said, I don't do much database stuff except when I start yet another podcast with another domain and another website and I need to set up WordPress. So this will actually come in really handy for me, I think. So I will probably be installing it and running it. On to the feedback then. And first of all, a huge thank you to everyone who supported us for your PayPal donations. John Stoom, Richard Thompson, Gary Williams, and Tom Hardy. And our new monthly supporters, Martin Peterson, Nick Santini, El Dirco, I think, and Ian Simpson. And on Flatter, Johan V. Now, that is a big list of people. And I don't know how much of that's to do with the stickers and how much to do with the fact that we kind of missed the show because of our camp. But either way, thank you very much, guys. It really is helpful. And as we said before, we've still got a few stickers left. So if you've ever supported us, then let us know your address and we'll send some out to you. If you've never supported us before, then it would be nice if you helped us out with a couple of quid for the postage. And again, your address, and we'll send some stickers to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, everyone. It really helps. And the time and effort that went into deciding how big the Linux Luddite sticker should be, it pales into insignificance, the amount of time we spent on this podcast. It's a lot of discussion was had on how big this sticker should be. And I think we've absolutely nailed it. So you'll love it when it comes.
Here's hoping. And to those of you who have sent stickers, take a photo of it on your laptop or whatever and tweet us. And or email us a picture of it. It'll make us feel great. Anyway, before we get on with the proper feedback, I should give you the contact details. If you want to email us, show@linuxluddites.com or on Twitter, Facebook, and Google+. Or, of course, you can always leave a comment on the website.
So a few shows ago, we had our biggest ever giveaway, and that was a free ticket to OzCon in Amsterdam. And Andy Mitchell was the lucky winner of that, and he was good enough to get back in contact with us and send some notes as to his experience, and so that's what we start off with. So Andy says, "Thank you all for the great OzCon giveaway. I had a fantastic 2 days. One lecture I attended was by PayPal about password encryption and how they're using the open source metaphor to improve the way passwords are created, and also finding ways to eliminate them without compromising security. They're also preparing for the possibility of quantum computing and the massive problems this could mean for conventional security. Absolutely fascinating stuff. We were also assured that the NSA haven't approached them yet." He says, "Yeah, right." There's some awesome Sonic Pi stuff done by a very charismatic fellow from the University of Cambridge Computer Laboratory called Sam Aaron. He was making concert quality music by programming a Raspberry Pi 2 in Ruby and Python. He actually does live performances in clubs with the Raspberry Pi. The idea is to capture the imagination of kids by making something they can relate to rather than the dry stuff they have on the national curriculum. And Andy goes on to say that next year the conference is in London, and if it's anything like this one, it'd be well worth attending. One of the things I did find strange was the sea of Mac laptops. They were everywhere. Even the visual presentations were all done on either Mac or Windows machines running PowerPoint. I think this was a huge missed opportunity for LibreOffice and Linux, and a big fail on the part of the open source community. They really should have laid down some software criteria for the convention. Other than that, it's a great convention, and again, many thanks.
Well, that seems to be a trend among many conferences and conventions, that you see a lot of Macs and, a little bit of Windows here and there. I mean, we went to OpenTech, and that was the standout thing I found, that, that was all about open data and privacy and stuff. And just the number of Macs that were used and the lack of Linux that I saw there. So you'd think at OzCon, though, there'd be a bit more Linux, but I suppose these are professional people there who actually need to get stuff done. They can't be messing around with Linux.
Well, a bit of a burn there, Joe. But I'm glad that you got in touch, and it sounds like you had a really good time and were able to attend all the lectures and things. And thanks for sending some feedback, Andy. I really appreciate that.
Well, moving along then, and looking back at last show, Count Zero got in touch about some comments from my co-hosts. And he said, "As a long-time listener to the show, I feel I need to point out that optical media is in no way obsolete. Just about everybody I know uses DVD-Rs to back up their valuable data, in particular photos and videos, etc., on a regular basis. Capacity limitations aside, DVD-R is about the best, and certainly the most cost-effective, backup medium that's currently available to the ordinary user, as we can't all afford huge server racks in the basement. Those people who use smartphones and tablets may well be backing up some of their data to the cloud, which is actually putting it on someone else's computer, but those of us who started using computers in the 80s and 90s are not going to trust these services to look after our data. Not only that, but not everybody has access to the internet 100% of the time. Not to mention the vast amounts of time it would take to back up a whole system over the internet. Cloud backup services might be usable for small amounts of data over a period of time, but as a proper, regular backup method, it's not even close to practical. I've been using optical media backup since the 90s, and I found it extremely reliable. The proviso here is that you must buy good quality media. I've never had issues with using good quality DVD-R for backup. Though you do need to store them properly, that is, in a cool, dry, dark place, as heat will warp the disk, damp will rot them, and light will fade the die. As with all things, it's how you use it that makes the difference.
Okay, Joe, is it you or me that's going to rip this man apart?
All I can say is this guy, Count Zero, seems to live in a universe where portable hard drives do not exist.
But he's right.
No, he's wrong. He's wrong. Oh, yeah. Capacity limitations aside, yeah, 4.5 gigabytes on each disk. Yeah, that's really useful to me. Thanks a lot. Whereas I can buy a 2 terabyte portable bus-powered USB 3 hard drive that I can write to at like 70 plus megabytes a second. And I emailed him back about this. That's like 60 quid. And okay, pound for pound, it's slightly cheaper to burn stuff off to DVD-Rs. But how much is your time worth? I can just quickly copy stuff over. Okay, Paddy, when we were talking about backing up all the audio files that I end up creating to do this show, did we even consider for a second using optical media, or did we just think portable hard drive, plug it in, job done?
We thought 2 portable hard drives is the point. You've got one and I've got one. So we've got multi-site backup and we've got redundancy there. The point I think here is, what's your time worth? What's your data worth? Because your portable hard drive will seize within 20 years, I'm sure, and break. Whereas the optical media will still be sat there on the shelf in 80, 90 years' time if you buy decent quality stuff, and it'll still work.
Will it really? Will it really?
Yeah, and also only if you've stored it in a cool, dry, dark place all that time. You can't put it in your attic. You can't put it in the basement. You can't leave it in, the back of the kitchen cupboard. It's got to be in this like magical area that you have to store it. Joe's point about capacity limitations aside, that quote that he's said there, you cannot put capacity limitations aside when you're talking about backup. Everything is to do with storage. And you're not going to sit there and put 4.5 gig in, take it out, put it in, take it out, put it in. If that wasn't bad enough in the first place, it also means that you can't do differential backups. So let's say you've got a bunch of photos, fine. They may never change over time because it's chronologically ordered. Once they're burnt, that year is done. But what about your music database? What about your music library? It needs to be able to change, both add and take away. And once you've burnt that thing, you're not going to go back and change it, whereas with a USB drive, you can.
I think it's 2 against 2 here, and there's only one of you here, Paddy, so you're not going to win.
All right, moving on then.
Okay, so we talked about OggCamp and our kind of ideal open source conference last time, and a few people got in touch about that. The first of them was Harry Meyer, Frankincense, Gold, who said, "Stunned to hear that you question the need to video record the OggCamp presentations. Making video is child's play." And you replied to him, Jesse, didn't you, saying that making video is very easy, making good quality video, not so much.
Yeah, it's difficult to get a full discussion into a small tweet, but that was generally the point. And it's that, yes, you can get the images quite easily, but to get the audio to marry up and to get the sort of lighting right and maybe get the slides in and all that kind of stuff and bring it all together, and this is across 4 different rooms, the amount of equipment you need and the people you need to actually run that equipment and make sure it's all going correctly, it's quite a big undertaking. I don't think any of us on this show can disagree that we could make a video recording and get it done, but that's a one-off half-hour job. We're talking about recording multiple streams all at the same time for a whole day and make sure that the presenter is speaking to the microphone and do. There's a whole load of things that need to be thought of. So I don't think it's child's play, but I absolutely agree that recording the presentations would be brilliant.
Oh, yeah, definitely. As much of a technical challenge as it is, it's a technical challenge that should be taken on because it is a valuable addition to the conference and potential advert as well, as I said last time.
Yeah, like we said, it's annoying when there's a track you miss. So maybe later on at your hotel room, you could watch the one that you missed. It'd be very useful, or given time, later on in the week or the month, watch it and catch up. And Ian Simpson also got in touch with some feedback on OggCamp. And he gave us a background on DEC, the Digital Equipment Corporation User Society conferences in the 80s and 90s. These were mainly held at universities and had presentations organised by special interest groups. From his experience of these, he distilled the following points to note. He says, planned sessions enable attendees to make best use of their time. Schedules and streams are best published in advance. Time and facilities can be allocated for general discussions and for the unconference type sessions. And he goes on to say, the special interest groups have the knowledge and contacts to provide speakers and demonstration material. These groups may be based on podcasts, software usage, recreational and educational interests. He also says the central coordination should be handled by those with experience, but the individual sessions should be left to the groups. So there's clearly, he's thinking about splitting it out between those who organise the venue and those who actually deal with whatever the main track is. Another point he makes is that the university type of location is, as was said on the podcast, ideal if it can provide reasonably priced accommodation, eating and drinking facilities, as well as locations for sessions. This implies that events will have to take place when the student's not around. One problem is cost. Although volunteers can provide many services, there will always be overheads. Sponsors are always in demand, and in the free environment like OggCamp, large companies with big purses are rare. However, smaller companies and organisations like Entryware will often look for opportunities to display their wares and get their names known. And the final point he makes is that plans must be made well in advance, with publicity going to all groups that may be interested. This includes local and national media. So he's clearly had quite a bit of experience, and I think he said he'd been to a whole load of different universities in the UK and had distilled his ideas down to that, some of which we covered in the podcast, and some of which I think we need to sort of take on board, or whoever it is that looks at OggCamp in the future. But he clearly is a big advocate for having known speakers and a known track and pre-advertising it to make people aware of what they can expect, at least from some known speakers, and then the sort of unconference happens as well as that. Whereas I think at the moment, OggCamp has a more of a fully unconference feel about it, doesn't it?
Well, there's an almost fully unconference feel about it. I think there have been years where it was fully unconference, and there have been years when there's been an almost fully booked main track. And from my experience of it, it's been better and better attended when there was a fully booked main track. I think it's very important to have the unconference stuff as well, but if I were the king of OggCamp, then I would definitely mandate a fully booked main track.
Well, changing tack completely, and Keith said G got in touch regarding our Sailfish review, and Keith said, interesting he had problems with the Yola and Linux for file storage. Never had problems myself using Dolphin on KDE, although frankly I've taken to using SSH SFTP instead. I actually have Play services and the store itself on my Yola, and although a few are glitchy, they nearly all work fine, although I love the native apps that exist, for example Gpodder. In terms of Sailfish OS being open sourced, although they've been slowly opening the different components, I do wish they'd open it fully. Weirdly though, I feel like Sailfish OS is more open than Ubuntu when I install both on my Nexus 4. Because with Sailfish OS, I can open up a terminal and use a real package manager, edit configs as root, compile and install libraries and applications, and so on. By comparison, the read-only nature of the Ubuntu root file system takes away the feeling of having a full distro under the hood. It's also worth mentioning that Ubuntu Phone basically only exists because of libhybris, which translates between Bionic and glibc, and thus allows for Android drivers to run, which was developed by a Yola engineer. There's a subtly complimentary story at work here.
Well, the first point, we were never going to try it on Dolphin, were we? Any of us. So, maybe you would have more success there. And as for the Play services and the Play Store, I don't know, did I just assume that it wouldn't work and didn't try it, maybe?
No, I don't think it's an assumption. On the website, it says, do this at your own risk. This could crash things. It's gonna fall around your ears. So I think I was put off by rhetoric from the actual developers and therefore thought, well, let's just try without it. And part of the point of using Selfish OS, I think, is to try and step away from some of the Android things. But it's interesting to hear that he's had it running and actually hasn't had a problem.
Yeah, I think I might have to flash it on my Nexus 4 and give it another go.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, the point he made about the Ubuntu phone having a read-only file system and the Selfish OS phones giving you more of a feeling of having a real Linux operating system because you get to tinker. And I do feel that maybe that shows that Ubuntu are looking for a more mainstream because they don't want people tinkering. They don't want people to get in and delve around and break it because you can't on a read-only. Whereas I'm not saying that the YOLO is looking for the tinkerers, but maybe that is going to come and bite them in the long run.
Which is strange because they put so much effort into the design side of things. And normally when products are unduly overly designed, and we're going to come back to that very shortly on this show, they are designed specifically for end users and not tinkerers.
And yet I swear Ubuntu phones are sold as being tinkerable, if that's a word. I know that Popey likes to run the Python simple HTTP server and stuff like that on his and, use it like a proper Linux box. So that was quite surprising to me to hear Keith say that it feels more like a real Linux box, I suppose, the YOLO phone.
And again, changing tack, we did seem to have quite a lot of different sections on the feedback this fortnight. Onto some HPC love. And John Hanks wrote in saying, HPC coverage by Linux Luddites, excellent. The important thing to note about the Open HPC announcement is who isn't signed on. NVIDIA, who compete with Intel in coprocessors, Mellanox, who compete with Intel in interconnects, AMD, who compete with Intel in CPUs and coprocessors, and no mention of ARM. This is a publicity grab by Intel and its resellers and large users leading into next week's supercomputing conference. If anything comes out of it in the long term, it's most likely to be an Intel marketing campaign.
They've got Paddy level of cynicism there.
Yeah, this, of course, referring back to last time when we were talking about high-performance computing.
Yeah, and it was something Nathan D. Smith also picked up on, and Nathan said, your friendly neighbourhood rookie HPC sysadmin checking in here. One area with huge growth coming in HPC space is healthcare. Current DNA sequencing technology has reached the price point where it will begin to be used in the treatment of a number of illnesses, with cancers perhaps being at the forefront. Whole human genomes are definitely big data and require HPC systems for processing. There are other applications of HPC in healthcare as well, including advanced microscopy.
And it's one of those things that you realise if you build it, they will come. I didn't know we'd have anyone who was actually a sysadmin for HPC. So it's interesting to hear from you, Nathan.
Yeah, and also interesting that I'd never really thought about the medical applications for it. I'd always thought of it as kind of, stock market stuff and big data, but I hadn't really thought that DNA sequencing counts as big data. But then in retrospect, it's really obvious. So, thanks for flagging that up, Nathan. Very interesting. But that'll do it for the feedback then. Let's move on to Jesse's first impressions.
So for this first impression, we're going to be looking at a distribution called VeltOS. And it came to my attention because Ike sort of made a comment about it on Google+, and they'd had a little bit of a falling out between Ike and the developers of VeltOS, which we'll come to in the discussion afterwards. But it's fundamentally a very, very new distribution. I said in the top of the show that it's alpha, and I think the actual release is pre-alpha, it's 0.1. And it may not seem like a good idea to be reviewing something like this. So the review is going to be fairly short because it's unfair to critique something which isn't even at sort of a release candidate or even a version 1. But it's more what they're doing and how they're doing it, which is the interesting point. So VeltOS is released in September of this year. It is built upon Arch, and it has a goal to be community driven. Now, I know that is said a lot about distributions, but with this, it's the community making the decisions, and that's going through using a voting process. So the actual software which is going to be on it is voted, and the desktop environment will be voted and things like this. So again, we'll come to the voting process because that's an interesting point. But just on the actual distribution itself, installing it, we normally talk about for a little bit on these first impressions. And I think we're all going to realize that installing it isn't really an option. So if you go to their website, you can download the ISO, and they actually say it's best looked at in a virtual machine or on a live disk. And the ISO is only live. There's not even an option within it to install. And the only way to get it on hardware is to install Arch and then install their packages once you've added their repository, which I did. And I don't know whether it's my inability with Arch or my inability with VeltOS, or maybe it's because it's so new, but I couldn't actually get it installed and running. I got to the login, which is LightDM, but once I put my username and password in, it just went to a black screen with a mouse icon. So hardware install didn't go well. Unfortunately, I didn't have the time to run backwards and forwards looking at whether it was Arch or Velt that was the problem. And given that it's so pre-alpha, I figured it may just be Velt, in which case I'd be there forever. So I looked at it on a USB drive. What about you guys?
Hang on. You say you looked at it on Arch. Did you really, or do you mean Manjaro?
No, full on Arch. My plan was Manjaro because I thought that at least gets it installed. And then I started to ponder, well, what if Manjaro comes with all this bloat and it starts to mess with what VeltOS is trying to install, and you won't see the true VeltOS because it is on top of a minimal Arch install. And I've installed Arch half a dozen times before, so it's not like it's something I've never done. And I thought I was fairly confident about doing it. You know, I took an evening and in we go, and clearly an evening wasn't quite long enough.
Okay, fair enough. Well, you asked how we tried it out. I didn't read any of the documentation, of course. I just chucked myself into it. So I downloaded the ISO, DD'd it, booted it on my test machine, looked for install, couldn't find it, and thought, that's the end of that then. And didn't think about it for another few days before I went back to it and checked it out. And I had actually been looking at Ike's distro, SolusOS, which is almost ready for release. It's almost there. So I kind of had that to contrast it with, because what we're talking about is the budgie desktop here, isn't it, really? I mean, VeltOS is basically budgie on top of Arch, as opposed to budgie on top of Solus, which is its own independent thing.
Yeah, they've got a few of their own packages that they've got in their repos, but fundamentally it's the budgie on top of Arch. And because it's such a new distribution, a lot of the choices as to what gets added to that are yet to be made. And that's where the community comes in, is their plan to make those decisions.
Yeah, I must admit, I span it up in a virtual box and had a look at it, not for a vast amount of time. You said about the LightDM greeter, though. Looking at the Arch instructions, it says to use the VOS greeter. So I was wondering if the instructions you were following are a little bit out of date by now.
I think basically they've taken LightDM and tweaked it. They have from what I can see, they have a tendency to use something that works perfectly well and then fork it and call it VOS. So you're right, there's the VOS greeter and there's the VOS desktop and VOS wallpapers and other bits and bobs. And I think that they're basically packages you would recognize, which they started out with Budgie, they started out with LightDM, and they've just slightly tweaked them. Another point we need to get out straight away, and I feel it's maybe because it's a very early release and because they're a small group, it's been released by Velt Technologies, is that their server and their website and their repositories seem to be very slow. I appreciate your effort, Joe. He downloaded it and shared it on our Google Drive account so that we didn't have to go through the hours of downloading of the ISO, which I didn't realize it was going to be that slow. And when I look at the website and when I updated the repositories and installed these various packages on my minimal Arch install, it took ages. It took so long that Pac-Man timed out. That's how bad it was.
Well, it was kind of hit and miss because the first time I tried to download it, I think it took about 6 hours and I just left my laptop on. But then the second time it was just really quick. So I don't know. Yeah, it seems to be up and down, really, with the speeds you're going to get.
They must have added another Pi to the cluster.
Maybe.
So come on, let's talk about the desktop. I mean, you mentioned it's based on Budgie, Jesse, and at the moment it does seem to be fairly stock Budgie, but it's not going to stay that way, is it?
No, so I'm wondering how much we get into the tete-a-tete about Budgie. And basically, they've taken the Budgie desktop and they had that as their main desktop, and they decided there were a few things they wanted to change. And rather than going upstream and making those changes and getting Ike to work with that, they forked it and have made these changes. But I have to say they're minimal, to say the least. And you're right, other than that, it's basically Budgie on top of Arch. There's a slightly odd set of default software. I mean, there's a full LibreOffice suite, which is fine. They've gone with the Vivaldi browser as their default browser, which is unheard of in Linux as far as I'm concerned.
And that's from Opera, but it's still proprietary. It's not like Opera's open source version, which is what I thought it was at first. It's very strange to see a proprietary browser other than Chrome in a distro.
I thought Vivaldi was the sort of Russian-made one.
No, it's the guy who was the CEO and co-founder of Opera has left and started this up. And as far as I can tell, its main claim to fame is that the tabs actually change colour to match the background of whatever web page you're looking at.
Well, it seemed like a perfectly serviceable browser to me, but I didn't spend that much time in it, to be fair.
So in addition to LibreOffice and a browser, all very sensible, it has ZenMap, which is a GUI for Nmap, but it doesn't have an audio program. There's no MP3 player or anything like this. It seems very odd that they've gone to have, as I say, ZenMap, which I hadn't actually heard of, and a color profile viewer, which I think is a GNOME application, which are two very obscure things to have, yet not actually have a music player.
So does this come back to how they're picking their software and the fact that perhaps there is an open vote and they're still deciding on which music player is going to be included?
Yeah, I think we need to switch to talk about their method of voting. So the point you're making is that they have a poll system on their website. So someone can say, I think we should have a music player, as a good example. And in this instance, they put forward a poll with 4 options. And that was Lollipop, as I mentioned earlier in the show, Rhythmbox, Tomahawk, and the GNOME music player. And the idea is with this voting system is that if it's a multi-poll voting system, you have to get more than 50% in order to have that approved and put into the new release. Whereas if it's a 2-poll thing, you need to get more than 70% to get that put into the new release. Now, this first vote on the music player, none of them won. So what they did was they took the 2 highest scoring, which were Rhythmbox and Tomahawk, and then put it into a new poll just between those 2. The problem being that currently Rhythmbox is on 58 and Tomahawk is on 42. So neither of them are going to reach the 70% threshold required to claim a decision. And this is sort of the crux of the discussion is that actually a sensible way of doing it? Are they going to make a decision out of this? Is that decision going to be the right one?
It sounds like they should do what Twitch did when they tried to install Arch. Just fork bong.
Did that get installed?
I don't know. I didn't follow it. But it sounds like, a similar kind of, crowd mentality. I don't know. Is that really the way to put together a distro? I mean, I know that's kind of their USP, but you kind of relying on, dare I say it, the idiot masses to make your decisions for you. Surely you need to have either a person like Shuttleworth or some sort of organized hierarchy like Debian to make decisions properly. If you just throw every little decision out to the community, and I'm not saying ignore the community. I mean, look at Ubuntu Mate. What Martin does with that is he puts it out there when there's decisions that he wants help with, and he takes influence from the community. But to just totally rely on them, that just seems like a bad idea to me.
I also think they're overselling it because I can't see that they're offering the option to rebase the distro, so it is going to stay on Arch, I don't think if someone suggested they go to Debian, that would happen. I don't think they're allowing the user community to say, okay, let's move over to XFCE, for instance. So it's really the applications on top. And it's a bit like saying, okay, I've got this Ford Mondeo and it's going to have a diesel engine and wonderful community, come and tell us what colour the seats should be. It's that kind of level they're letting people get involved at.
Yeah, and if you're choosing what colour the seats could be, it's, of course, it's a difficult analogy to make, but you could, after you've bought that Mondeo and the community has chosen red seats, you can snap your fingers and get blue seats by installing it anyway. Okay, the metaphor doesn't work, but you know what I mean? Like, everything is in the Arch repos, or it's in the AUR, and so a lot of the discussions, of which there's not a lot, it's a fairly new distro, so let's not hold that against them, but a lot of the discussions boil down to, well, if you choose to go with this music player, anyone can install this one. And whether that works in your favour because you don't want the music player they want and you don't mind going to install it, or against your favour and they're going with the music player that you want, and you say to everyone else, well, just install what you like, it means that, well, what's the point in choosing a music player if everyone can install it? You may as well just not have a music player and people pick the one they want. And you're right, you can't switch the base, by clicking your fingers, because the amount of work there is to get all these things working nicely on top of Arch. I'm not saying that Arch is difficult to get things working nicely on top of, but you've gone to the effort to make sure everything works. You can't just switch the base out straight away. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm asking, in a way, is whether the whole voting thing is basically just a gimmick to get this distribution some publicity.
What, to get it on shows like this?
Absolutely. Seems to work, doesn't it?
Yeah, fair play to them.
But I mean, taking your point to a sort of middle ground. So let's say they've based it on Arch because the developers know Arch. Fair enough. You might as well stick with something you know. And putting applications in or out is a fairly minor thing. It's just what you're packaging when you make your ISO. But the desktop environment does define a distribution largely, and how well that incorporates into the base really sort of makes a positive user experience or a negative one. Yet there was a poll that someone put up that said, should we have a material design look? And the problem is that if everyone votes yes, the developer then has to change their long-term plan to have Budgie or a fork of Budgie or whatever it might be, and try and find something material design-y. Okay, so they make that change. What happens in 3 months' time when another poll gets put up and someone says, what desktop environment should we have? And Unity gets voted in. Does he then have to change all the work that he's put into making a material design look and switch it to Unity?
Well, yeah, all good points that go back to my point that you need to have some sort of either dictatorship or hierarchical democracy, but you can't just have the system that they're trying to implement here. I mean, they can say that we're the only distro doing this. Well, why are you the only distro doing that? Because it doesn't work. But I don't want to bag on it too much and be too negative, because I do like Budgie as a desktop. It's sensibly laid out. There's a few little things that I could complain about, but on the whole, I think it works quite nicely. It's modern, it's based on modern technologies, and yet it doesn't try and be ridiculously flashy. So it does have that going for it. I mean, I know that comes from Ike's project Solus, but I don't think there's any shame in taking a bit of open source software and re-implementing it yourself. And I really like the idea that, at least in theory, if you're not a complete noob like you, Jesse, you can take the relevant packages that you need and install them on top of Arch and have VeltOS. And we've talked about that many times, haven't we? Why bother spinning up all these new ISOs when you just need meta packages? And so you have to commend them for at least trying to do that.
Yeah, one thing I would not commend them for is selecting Numix icons.
I didn't have a huge problem with that. I know that's a bugbear of yours, but I think just visually, generally, it wasn't spectacular. It wasn't horrible for me. It just was what it was. And it looked fairly modern and no complaints.
I think at some stage we're going to have to do a piece on user interface design and user experience, because new mix is everywhere and it really is the work of the devil, because icons are there to signify something and they don't. They might look pretty, but they don't actually they don't represent what they're supposed to, which defeats the whole point of icons.
Yeah, I'm sort of looking at my settings icon on Ubuntu and thinking, did I install the Numix theme? And I don't understand what that icon is. I just learnt that green thing is the settings icon. I know exactly what you mean. It should be obvious by what it is. Or is a cog a sensible settings icon? Or have I just learnt that that's what the settings is?
I think we're in danger of doing that piece now, aren't we?
We are. Can we briefly talk about the menu and what their plans are for that, though, which kind of brings us back nicely to what we're talking about at the top of the show, even though we'd not planned to.
Well, I quite like the menu as is, so I'm suddenly filled with trepidation as to what they're going to do to it. So you better tell me, buddy.
Well, you probably would like it as is, because it's one of those horrible searchable menus you're talking about.
Yeah.
So we've got categories down the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, you've got those categories with the actual applications in at the moment. Now, the bit on the right-hand side, you can make into a simple list just by turning off the category headers. That's kind of pointless because it doesn't sort the applications into alphabetical order. They're exactly the same order as they were before, just without the category headings there. And you can go even further and turn off the category headings on the left-hand side, so you just get a list of applications. Again, not in alphabetical order. But I was looking on the website and they're proposing yet another design for the menu, which has everything in alphabetical order, which is a good start, but not categorized. So under C, for example, you'd have calculator, cheese, and chromium. And we're back to what we were talking about earlier, where unless you know what the applications do, it's going to confuse the hell out of you. There's no sort of semantic order there for them whatsoever.
That does sound a little bit dodgy, because although I do like a searchable menu, sometimes you don't know what you're searching for, and going back to the old hierarchical menu makes more sense. So, but if you're going to have very few applications installed and available, at least that's how it feels with Solus OS. It's kind of, this is what you've got and you kind of take it or leave it. Then maybe you don't need to get beyond a searchable menu. I don't know. Maybe I'm just trying to defend it here.
So what you're saying is they need just a search bar when you press the menu button.
Yeah, maybe it could pop up full screen and like search Amazon and stuff while you're trying to search for your applications. Yeah, it's a good idea. I might implement that.
And what about minimized windows? What about down in your taskbar? What's going on there?
What, the little kind of circly icon things?
Yeah.
Well, you say the little circly icons, and I think, it's taking inspiration from Windows 7. So at work, I've got rid of the words that show you what the application is and just have the icons, and you can pin them to that bottom menu in Windows and in VeltOS. So it has a sort of a Windows 7-y theme to that.
I like to have the words, please, as well as an icon. And fair enough, have an option, like you say in Windows. I don't know, I've never really investigated that. But you can't just have just the icons, because, I don't know, that's just not right. You know, I've currently got 3 Skype windows open. I want to know which one's which from, what's written on it.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, the way Unity works is it puts a number of dots next to the icon, and then when you click it, it brings up the 2 example windows, and you pick which one you want, or 3 example windows in your case, and you pick the one you want. But I'm not sure they do that in VeltOS, so I don't know how they do multi-windows for single applications. Maybe no one's ever got that far.
Maybe.
Because the problem is that you don't install it, pardon me, you run it as a live distro. They haven't got their installer and everything ready unless you do the minimal arch and then the applications on top. And so no matter what you install, every time you boot it back up, there's nothing there, which I know is not a critique of VeltOS, but of course is an issue with the way that live distributions work. But it doesn't feel that you can really get to use it because it is fresh every single time.
Yeah. And I mean, I did a Pac-Man SYU, and then it just kind of fell to bits really after that. So, I don't think it's fair to criticize it for that because it is very pre-alpha or whatever. It's not a final release. So we're more looking at the concepts here rather than the finished product, because it isn't a finished product. But it is difficult to do that, as you say, until you can install it and live with it at least for a day or so.
Okay, so let's back up to the concepts then. And as far as I can see, we're talking about a desktop here that's quite pretty to look at, but not usable. We're talking about a desktop environment that's been ripped off from another distribution, and now they're forking it and don't want to feed anything useful back upstream. And we're talking about a distro that is asking for input on packages to be selected and what have you, but aren't actually allowing the users to make any fundamental choices.
Well, it's all too easy to be negative, isn't it, Paddy?
Yeah, why don't you say something negative? Why don't you say how you really feel, Paddy?
Yeah. I don't think that it's this idea of ripping off open source software, and that's something that I would disagree with Ike on. He was a bit miffed, shall we say, that they stole it. But it's open source software. That is literally the point of it, that anyone can take it and do their own thing. So that is not a valid criticism in my mind. The other stuff you said, maybe, but essentially they've taken Budgie and stuck it on top of Arch, which you could probably do yourself more easily, or maybe even with more difficulty. But if you want to just quickly spin up the Budgie desktop and you're used to Arch, then this is surely the way to do it. For now, at least.
I mean, yeah, I just wonder whether or not you'd have exactly the same pre-alpha sort of worries if you did it yourself versus using this. I mean, they don't have a way of installing it. You have to install the packages separately. So you're basically might as well go out and install the Budgie desktop separately and live with it having installed it yourself. But given time, I see what you're saying. Given time, if this was a mature distribution, then yeah, this would be the way of getting a known Budgie desktop on top of Arch. But actually, no, you'd get the Velt desktop on top of Arch.
Okay, let me try and ask my question in a less negative manner then, or a slightly different question. Do either of you two see this distribution being around in 5 years' time?
I think it would attract people to the idea that you have a direct input into the answers and the results of the questions, and therefore can steer where it's going. However, that only works when you're one of 30 people and you have a real, your percentage of your vote is a big one. When there's like 10 million people voting and you basically are going to come at it as, well, these are the options that have been put. I have a desktop environment with these predefined things, which is what every other desktop environment has. And the only way that it would actually stay around in 5 years is if it became popular because of the choices, not because of the way you make those choices.
So essentially, no.
Politely, no.
Yeah, I'm afraid I have to agree, really. I think that Solus has got a very reasonable chance of being around in 5 years, but Velt might fall by the wayside like so many others.
Do you feel that in 5 years' time, people are going to be replaying this quote and laughing at us?
No, we'll be long gone by then, so don't worry. And on that bombshell, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com, find us on Twitter or Google Plus or the Facebook communities, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again next week for more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, Vel.
See you later.